Most of you are familiar with this. This is where our story started, my brother's and my story, and you probably heard of my memoir called The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, and if not, you can buy it out front and you can read it, and this is my personal memoir. And this is from a picture taken by my mother in 1957 on the edge of the Black Canyon of the Gunnison. That's where we grew up, in a small town called Paonia, Colorado, and that was the first abyss either one of us ever saw. It's one of the deepest gorges in the western United States. Well, you probably have heard the story of our trip to La Chorrera in 1971. My brother and myself went to La Chorrera along with some similarly sort of inspired or crazy friends. La Chorrera is a small mission town in southern Colombia. And the reason we went to La Chorrera is because we had heard about a paper published by Schultes called Virola as an orally active hallucinogen. That was the title of the paper. Why were we interested in that? We were completely fascinated by DMT. DMT emerged in the late 60s, and my brother, being very good at working the matrix, came up with samples of DMT, which we sampled, and we were utterly amazed. But the problem with DMT is it's very, very short. You can't really come back with much information other than, holy shit, what was that? Just astonishment, and we wanted to go a little deeper. So we thought, well, if you could find an orally active form of DMT, maybe it would last longer, this very naive idea, and we could spend more time in that dimension, and we thought of it as a dimension. And so we heard about this orally active form of DMT, and we said, that's it, that's the secret, we've got to go for this. This was 1971. The role of the DMT-containing admixtures in ayahuasca was poorly understood. Schultes had graduate students working this out, but none of this had been published. So this orally active form of Virola, which is a member of the Myristicaceae family, the nutmeg family, was interesting. And the Virola is a genus of trees in the nutmeg family, and the sap is full of DMT and 5-methoxy-DMT, quite large amounts of it, and something else that makes it orally active. So we decided to go look for this thing. It was this thing, which was called ukuhe, was a traditional Witoto shamanic preparation. Many tribes in the Amazon use Virola as a snuff, and that makes sense because it's inactivated if you take it orally by monoamine oxidases in the gut. So by taking the snuff, you go around that. That's the basis of ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is orally active, but it contains inhibitors of the enzymes, monoamine oxidases, that break down DMT before it's ever absorbed. Well, anyway, we heard about this ukuhe, this traditional Virola shamanic medicine. And the reason we went to La Chorrera is because that was the ancestral home of the Witoto people that had this, and a couple of other tribes. So we went there looking for this ukuhe, which we called the secret, right? It was the secret. Well, when we got to La Chorrera, we didn't find the ukuhe. What we found was this. Psilocybe cubensis, the pan-tropical psilocybin mushroom. It happened to be the rainy season, and they had cleared pasture around this little mission village, and they brought in these white-humped Cebu cattle. So out of every cow pie, because psilocybe likes to grow on cow pies, were huge clusters of these psilocybin mushrooms. I mean, big clusters. And we knew what they were. We'd done our homework. We had no experience with them at all, but we knew what they were. So we kind of thought, well, okay, that's great. These are here. We can play with these until the real secret emerges. So we started eating these things at rather substantial doses and rather regularly. like daily, like sometimes several times a day. And they quickly rearranged our priorities. And they made it clear that they were the real secret, and they had a lot to teach us, which we were eager to learn. And so the rest of it is in the book. I'm not going to go into it because it would take all night, and it's very hard to explain it. You have to read about it. Even if you read about it, you won't know what's going on. And I mean, I wrote it, and I still don't know what's going on. But it was a profound experience anyway. But we never did find the ukuhe, and it didn't really matter at that point. This was all 1971. But flash forward 10 years to 1981. Now I'm a graduate student at UBC working under Dr. Towers. I had been working on psilocybin. I had been, quite honestly, failing fungal genetics, and I was getting quite frustrated. And Dr. Towers called me into the office one day and said, well, you want to go to Peru? And I said, yes, my bags are packed. When do we leave? So I shifted my investigations from all this lab work and all this fungal genetic stuff. I was trying to look at the genetic regulation of psilocybin, psilocin biosynthesis. I had growth chambers full of mushrooms in the biology building. It was truly a golden age. But anyway, I shifted, and I went to Peru, and the idea was to do a comparative study between ayahuasca, which was an orally active tryptamine psychedelic, and ukuhe. And as it turns out, the Witoto people had been forcibly relocated, most of them from their ancestral home at La Chirera, to a town called near a town called Pebas, which was on the Amazon. So this time we went to Pebas, and we went up the Rio Ampiacu, which was where these Witoto and Bora villages were. And it was at this point that I had met Wade one time, very briefly at UBC when he dropped by the lab, but we ran into each other in Iquitos. There's a story there, but the upshot of it was that what's most accurate is he had already had plans to go to this area. So we were able to tag along in a sense, and we had participated in this expedition up the Yampiyaku, which means the river of poisons. Now, I don't know if this pointer probably won't do it, but this just gives you the geography. Up at the top there is La Chirera, and the Putumayo is the river that separates Peru on the south and Colombia on the north. Then further south is the Amazonas, and going down the Amazonas from Iquitos, a day and a half, you come to Pebas, and then from Pebas you can go up the Ampiacu to this string of villages where these people are. And so Wade, thank God he was there, because you never saw a more clueless bunch than the people that were along on this expedition, including myself and another graduate student from Neil Towers' lab, and people from the Institute of Ecotechnics who provided some of the logistic support, only a fraction of what was promised. But it was an interesting adventure, and actually we managed to make the best of it. So here's a picture of Wade on the left there, and me in this boat going up. I think we're still on the Amazon on the way to Pebas. So when we got to these villages where we knew this, also I should mention, yes, my brother, shown here, standing under a Varroa tree. What happened to the sound? Okay, maybe it's my head. Maybe it's the voices in my head or my hearing aids. I don't know. Anyway, he managed to insert himself into this phase of the expedition and came along with us for a couple of weeks. And so he was there. And the idea was very simple, to go to this area and collect samples of this ukuhe, it was not so easy because it was a dying tradition. The people had largely forgotten how to do it. But there were a few that we contacted, a few informants who sort of remembered how to make it, and they said, well, yeah, we'll give it a shot, and so they made it for us. Then we were able to collect samples and bring those back to the laboratory and analyze them. And so, of course, it comes from the sap. So in order to make the ukuhe, you have to strip the bark off, and this is Wade and me attacking a kumala tree. And then they took that material, and one of the several informants we talked about was able to actually make an active form of this ukuhe. Strip the bark off, cook it down, concentrate it, mix it with ashes, and then you come up with this material, which, well, I don't have to tell you what it resembles. Tastes pretty much like that too. But you take about a third of this, and you get a very profound reaction. And when I took it, all ethnopharmacologists have to bioassay in the field if you're collecting these psychoactive drugs. So, of course, I tried it, and Terence took careful notes. Everybody else watched. It's not particularly pleasant. In fact, it's darned unpleasant. It's physiologically quite alarming. But when I took it, I said later, it's a lot like 5-methoxy-DMT, which is one of the constituents we knew was in there. And I had very little experience with it. But when I finally got it back to the lab, sure enough, it was basically only very high amounts of 5-methoxy-DMT. And it was certainly orally active. So that was the first phase of our expedition, and then Terence went home. This is him getting ready to get on the plane in our hotel in Iquitos, and he's putting Varroa seeds into a bag, trying to smuggle Varroa seeds back to Hawaii, so where he had some land. And finally we got rid of him, and I was able to continue with my work. Terence was very much a disruptor, as you might have known, might have guessed. He was, and he wanted to repeat the experiment at La Chorrera. I told him, nothing doing. I am here to do serious ethnobotany work, and I don't want you making any trouble. So he was disappointed, and eventually he left, and And then I shifted my work to the study of ayahuasca. I published on the Varroas, but nobody noticed that work, and the work on ayahuasca eventually, there were a number of publications came out of it. This is an ayahuasca vine that I introduced to the Big Island in 1976. This is the mother plant. This actually came from one of Schultes' students. It was a gift of Tim Plowman, who both Wade and I know as friends. He passed on a few years ago. But this plant is still there, and these are the exact opposite of shrinking violets. You've heard of shrinking violets? Well, these are, I think the term in BC is skookum plants. This thing weighs about 5 tons. It's 1,500 feet long. We think of trees as the only big plants. Ayahuasca vines, if left to their own devices and not harvested, can get at least that big. And then, of course, the other one is the admixture plants, in this case, Psychotria viridis, that carries the DMT. And you all know this. I don't have to go into this. There's the ayahuasca vine that has the beta-carbolines that inhibit MAO, and then basically 2 kinds of admixture plants, Chacruna, Psychotria viridis, in the coffee family, and then north of the Putumayo, another member of the same family as ayahuasca, the Malpighiaceae, Diploteris cabarena. It does not have the beta-carbolines, it has DMT. So these are the 2 primary admixture plants for ayahuasca. Now, this gentleman here, Don Fidel Mozambite, was my first informant and for the ayahuasca phase of my research. And Don Fidel, it turned out to be a lucky discovery because this guy was the real deal. He knew his plants very well. He knew how to prepare ayahuasca. He was very kind. He let us hang out and sample it and take samples to analyze, and was just, he understood what the agenda was. He understood that there was science involved, and he was cooperative. And this fellow was discovered earlier by Terrence and Kat on a previous trip to Pucallpa in Peru. So I had an introduction, and we had other informants, but Don Fidel turned out to be one of the best informants I ever worked with. Another fellow, very important, that I still work with and revere very much is Juan Ruiz Macedo. He is a botanist. He is the director of the herbarium at UNAP in Iquitos. At the time that I first came in '81, he was just a forestry student. And the then director of the herbarium, Dr. Franklin Ayala, just said to Juan, take these people out and get them the plants they need. I'm sure the subtext of that conversation was, and bring them, don't let them do anything stupid, and bring them back alive, which he did. And I have since worked with Juan on various projects. He is an encyclopedic source of knowledge about medicinal plants of all kinds. He can identify plants to the scientific name if you just hand him a leaf or a fragment of a leaf. He can tell you the scientific name, what it's used for, the common name, usually one or two funny stories about botanists that he's encountered. So the man is a treasure. He is an example of what they mean when they say when a medicine man dies, it's as though a library has burned down. He's the library, and none of it's written down. Well, I finally got this stuff back to the lab and spent the next 3 years working out the chemistry and the pharmacology and all that. When I showed up at customs in Vancouver after 6 months of collecting, I dumped all my samples, plant presses, bottles, everything out on the table. I had permits for all this, to import it, but the young woman, customs agent, looking at this, she looked at what I dumped, and she looked at me and she said, "You're the people my supervisor warned me about." And she said, "Just get out of here." So I packed it up and I phoned a cab and I took it to UBC. So as all graduate students are supposed to do, eventually you have to publish this. So my first papers, one on the ayahuasca and another on the ukuhe, appeared in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology in 1984, and those were the first of my publications. Okay, so flash forward another 10 years. By this time, I've published several papers on ayahuasca. I'm getting a little bit of notice in the scientific community, and I was invited, along with some other researchers, to participate in a biomedical study on ayahuasca by the UDV, one of the Brazilian churches. So they invited us to a conference, myself, Eduardo Luna, some other anthropologists and chemists, pharmacologists, and so on. And the real agenda was they wanted to carry out a biomedical investigation of ayahuasca, in part because they were interested. Is it harmful? Is it beneficial? And what might that be? The other aspect of it was a political agenda. The CONFEN, the regulatory body in Brazil, which is kind of a combination of the FDA and the DEA, was considering banning it. And so they wanted outside investigators to come in and do a study. They felt that foreign scientists, for some reason, would carry more credibility, although we had Brazilians also. So we went to Manaus in 1993. I was able to get some support for this. And we went to the Núcleo Calpari in Manaus, the original, oh, here it is. Okay. Oh, that's nice. Didn't even notice. Anyway, Nucleocalperi, the original temple or church of the UDV, there was no hospital or anything to do the study, so we just set up shop in the temple and carried out the experiments. First, we had to do a preparo, though, what they call a preparo, which you can see here. It's basically an industrial scale production of ayahuasca. They have to produce enough ayahuasca for 10,000 people every 2 weeks. And that was back in 1993. Now it's about 30,000 people. But they do it all sustainably. They grow their ayahuasca, and they know how to do a preparo. They also know how to make excellent brew, as it turns out. So we carried out the preparo. This is a process that takes about 48 hours, and it's as much a ceremony and a ritual as it is a process of brewing the material. Many songs are sung and rituals made. And then once we had the material, we carried out the investigation in the temple. And Dr. Charles Grobe, who some of you have heard of, he's a researcher at UCLA and one of the Hefter members, Jace Calloway and myself, a number of Brazilian scientists carried this out. And we administered a number of different things: psychological screening, the usual physical measurements, heart rate, blood pressure, pupillary diameter, the things you would expect. What was most revealing and most interesting was that we conducted in-depth psychiatric sort of life story interviews with our 15 subjects, all of whom were men, all of whom had been in the UDV at least 10 years, drinking ayahuasca on an average of every 2 weeks. Some had been in it for as long as 40 years. So we asked them, with the help of a Brazilian psychiatrist who spoke Portuguese, the interviews were conducted in Portuguese, and we asked them, what brought you to ayahuasca? How did you come to join the UDV? They almost all told the story that they had come at a time of crisis in their lives. These people were plagued by alcoholism, drug abuse, domestic violence, all the kinds of dysfunctionalities that one encounters in society. They came at a time when they didn't know where else to turn. Usually a friend in the UDV urged them to come. They almost all said that their initial ayahuasca experiences were terrifying. They could see where they were going. They could see their future and what was going to happen to them if they didn't change. And there was almost always a redemptive moment as well in these experiences where the prophet or the Mestre Gabriel, who was kind of the prophet or the Jesus figure in the UDV, would appear in some context. And they would see that and they would feel, okay, it's going to be okay. And they all felt if they stayed in the UDV that provided a supportive context and they were able to reform their lives. And every one of them did. There was, it cured their alcoholism, it cured their drug addiction, their family life was good. I used to tease them. I used to say, you guys are like psychedelic Mormons. You're just straight-laced. But I made it complimentary to Mormons because Mormons also very much emphasize community. And the members of the UDV really felt that the community of the UDV was as important as the tea, as they called it. They felt that neither one independently would have been sufficient. So we also took some biochemical measurements that were interesting, that turned out to be interesting. We used platelets and platelet receptor binding studies as a biochemical measure, a peripheral biochemical measure of changes in the central nervous system. This is commonly done. The platelets, changes in the receptor profiles of platelets reflects central nervous system changes, and they have all the monoamine receptors, serotonin, dopamine, etc. So we did receptor binding on the platelets, and it turns out there was a distinct biochemical difference between members, long-time drinkers of ayahuasca, and an age-matched control of people of similar age and socioeconomic status who did not drink ayahuasca. And what we found was that the serotonin transporters, not the receptors, but the presynaptic proteins that control the release and reuptake of serotonin, were significantly elevated in the ayahuasca drinkers compared to the controls. What does that mean? We had no idea, but it was an interesting finding. And this was not an acute effect. This was after 3 or 4 weeks of washout where they hadn't been taking ayahuasca. So it was a persistent effect. What did it mean? We really had no idea. So we did what you always do. We dug into the literature. And it turns out there is quite an extensive literature about deficits in these transporters. Abnormally low levels of these transporters are associated with various kinds of alcoholism, suicidal behavior, homicidal behavior, depression, basically all the dysfunctions or causes of many of the dysfunctions we found in this sample. So it was almost too neat, too neat a fit. Here we find an unexpected finding, and then we see that in the literature this has been studied from the perspective of pathology. But there it is, you can read the papers, and there it is. So what is this, what is the next step? Well, we haven't really crossed that, but this is potentially, what it suggests is that ayahuasca can actually reverse these long-term neurological, neurochemical pathologies that is associated with these behavioral problems. This is a picture of after we did this study, we did it in '93. There were not a lot of papers in the peer-reviewed literature about ayahuasca. But after that, there was an explosion of research. So these are the dates, and these are the number of peer-reviewed papers that you can now find on PubMed. How many of you know about PubMed? Yeah, the health professionals, the scientists do. Go to PubMed and search on ayahuasca if you want to see what the state of the art is. And yeah, you'll be amazed. Okay, I guess I better hurry. I got 2 minutes. Okay, this flash forward another 10 years or so. I was invited by the Stanley Medical Research Foundation to do essentially bioprospecting for plants that might be used to treat either schizophrenia or dementias, cognitive disorders. So I got this grant, and that's what enabled me to sort of renew my connection to Peru. It paid for several trips down there. One of the people that helped us was Alan Shoemaker, who's an expat. Some of you may know him. He used to organize shamanism conferences in Iquitos. This is our group here. We went to Genaro Herrera initially to collect some of these plants. And these are some of our colorful compatriots, a guide named Aku there on the right. He passed away a few years ago. And on the left, a fellow named Carlos Pabon, who looks like he just left a gang in East LA, but he's actually a brilliant molecular biologist. And we came up with a paper which we published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology. You can read all that. During part of our expedition, we were accompanied by a filmmaker, a young woman named Sarah Hutt. And that's Sarah there in the center, or in the paint, and she accompanied us. She was making a film about traditional medicines and wanted to tag along. So I said, sure, you can tag along. So we went. This is actually back on the Ampiacu, the Rio Ampiacu. We caught her just in time. She was about to go native, and we rescued her from that. And eventually, she came up with a nice little documentary called The Shaman and the Scientist, which has just been completed. You can find it online. I think it's on Vimeo, and it's won a couple of awards. So it's very nice. It's only 20 minutes long, and I'm not going to show it to you for obvious reasons. But it's a good documentation of the way that science and traditional medicine can come together. So there it is. So I'm getting there. Then this is last year. This is a conference I helped organize in the UK with the help of many people. It's a conference that is the 50th anniversary commemoration of a conference held in San Francisco in 1967 by the same name. The National Institute of Mental Health sponsored that conference, and then and that was a landmark conference. All the leading lights of ethnopharmacology at that time, such as Schultes, and there weren't many, were at that conference. Well, the book was very influential in my early career, so I've always wanted to do a follow-up conference, and we did that, and we had this conference at the UK, and live streamed all the lectures. You can, I think Stephen can put the link on the website. And then we actually published a symposium volume from it. We republished the original 67 volume and the 2017 volume as a matched box set. And again, this is another collaboration between Wade and myself. He very kindly agreed to be one of the editors. So his name is on it, along with Ian Prance, who used to be the director of Q, and Ben DeLeonen, who is the founder of ICERS. How many of you know what ICERS is? Good, good. International Center for Ethnobotanical Education, Research, and Service. Absolutely doing the best work in ethnobotany of these psychoactive plants to date. So the book is out there, it's for sale, and it's a limited edition, one of a kind, but important to to document essentially the current state of the art in ethnopharmacology, because in the last 50 years, a lot of things have happened. There's actually been research on this. So thank you very much. I'm sorry for going over.